Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. We're very happy to have yet another Facebook live sessions with the scholars of South Ilahi. Tonight, we will continue on the series on the history and theory of architectural Islam, the body, image, and spirit of place by Dr. Faris Hajamaidin and Faizan Shah. Dr. Faris Hajamaidin is director of the School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the Singapore Polytechnic, where he has been teaching history and theory of ideas since the year 2002. He completed his master's degree at McGill University School of Architecture and his PhD at the University of Adelaide Centre for Asian and Middle Eastern Architecture. His main research interest has been the study of the human body as a site for architectural imaginings, with a special focus on the relationship between Vitruvius's De Architectura and Platonic philosophy. Recently, he has studied the relationship of body and building in the works of the 12th century Muslim illuminationist Ishraqi Shihab al-Din al-Surawardi. He has written, taught, and presented invited talks on this topic. Faizan Shah is a lecturer and year coordinator at Singapore Polytechnic's Diploma in Interior Design, leading the Generative Design Atelier and teaching history and theory of ideas in across 3 years in a course. Completed his bachelor's in architectural design at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT, Australia, and Master of Architecture at Universitat Innsbruck in Austria. He developed interests in the complexities of engaging architecture with focus on the poetical and representational through theory and the instruments of perception. And just to remind all of you, at the end, we will have a question and answer segment. So if you have any questions during the lecture, you can actually send your questions to +65 8776 7706. That's +65 8776 7706. Without further ado, we'd like to invite Brother Faizan Shah to begin. Bismillah.
Bismillah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me share my screen and I think we can begin. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wal Fatih al-Mawlik wal Khatim ma sabaq. Nazir al-Haq bil-Haq wa risiratika mustaqim wa huwa alihi haqqa qadrihi bidali azim. Praises be to our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the key and the master of creation and the beloved of the beloved. I will start this lecture, but this is not a singular lecture. It is actually picking up from Dr. Faris's set of lectures, 2 sets of lectures actually. And we are in particular talking and speaking about history and theory of architectural Islam, the body, image, and the spirit of place. In particular, we're trying, in my segment here, we're trying to look at the image in terms of what is the architectural image and pertaining Islam in general, the generation of images. And I hope this discussion will be not only that, but it will circumvent a lot of things that we covered so far and hopefully into our discussions later. So arriving at a point that was left by where we are at 2 weeks ago, this is a quote from the Rasail of the Ikhwan as-Safa. Know, O brother, that the study of sensible geometry leads to skill in all the practical arts, highlighted here, while the study of intelligible geometry leads to skill in the intellectual arts. Highlighting this is looking at the sensible in the practical arts here, and also the intelligible, where it leads or alludes to the intellectual, right? So the meanings of which I think we can discuss further, but just to lay out the foundations of my starting point, as we say, because this science is not of the gates through which we move to knowledge of essence of the soul, that is the root of all knowledge. So laying this out by the Ikhwan is coming to a point that I would be using arts as a general term, that covers not only the architectural image or the architecture, as what we've mentioned in the previous discourse, but as an overarching kind of understanding of what our Islamic culture, visual culture especially, creative culture especially, and later in the slides to come, why is this very important in understanding and why it is important to actually comprehend the perception of visual culture, or at least the things that we can decipher as arts or architecture in that sense. So the Islamic arts are paths through which we can access the deepest truth of the cosmos, the revelation, and ourselves. The exclusion of these arts brings crisis not only to our implied aesthetics, but our ethical, intellectual, and spiritual lives. So, to exclude the understanding of this, what it implies here is that it's actually quite detrimental to not to know what is, in this sense, arts, and in brackets, Islamic arts, right? So the image on the right that I have here, a bit short circuiting and a bit fast forwarding. This is part of the Rasail, where getting to the essence of the soul and the root of all knowledge, coming into and sort of like bringing back together what Faris's lectures of the weeks before, a kind of a encircling of the roots of knowledge, isn't it? Where if you see at the top, it's the highest of the high, where you can see at the bottom a kind of a division, the fourfold division of the mineral, getting into plant, animal, and man, and eventually the angelic realm, and then there's this distribution of the whole, right? What is the holistic knowledge, and what is the dissection of parts of the whole that if we want to take on the journey to understand any parts of it, it is actually a sequence, a compartment of another and of another. So highs of the high, lows of the low, right and left. I think it is a kind a diagram that I think we need to unpack and also sort of like appreciate in the slides to come. But I think it's just a kind of foundation or the basis that where I'm starting from. The nature, or you can see the effacement here, the effacement of the nature of Islamic arts, right? So when does the definition begin, and when does art turn to exclude itself to become Islamic or otherwise? There's a deliberate effacement of the nature of Islamic arts. The understanding later we will know why, but go with me with this. So again, the use of the term art is actually quite deliberate, and also to pick up from where the Ikhwan mentioned. So if you look at the definition of Islamic arts are generally held to be the art made by artists, of artisans whose religion was Islam, for patrons who lived in predominantly Muslim lands. And underlined here, for purposes that are restricted or peculiar to Muslim population or Muslim setting. So this is the definition that in the dictionary of art would encapsulate what exactly Islamic art is. But by that definition, it actually sort of like separates Islamic arts from the rest, right? So there is a notion of the other here. And my interpretation of this is that is actually where we get, or our understanding get confused, because we see it as a kind of predominantly true segments in times and history. But as we know, or in the previous slide, as a start, that it is actually a inculcation or harvesting of everything else. It's about the cosmos. It's about the religion itself, right? So by this definition, we are going to see why there is a effacement of the nature of, because we are only about to sort of like recover the meaning of Islamic arts here. So it is not only a religion but a way of life. Islam fostered the development of a distinctive culture, and distinctive here means it is different from culture as they knew it. And when we mean they is, of course, the onus goes to the interpreter of this, with its own unique artistic language that is reflected in art and architecture throughout the Muslim world. In this, you can already feel and sense that the definition sets apart or drives the notion of setting apart from the rest. So Muslims had their own pre-existing artistic traditions, and initially at least those artists had worked under the Byzantine or Sennacian patronage, continued to work in their own styles, but for Muslim patrons. So kind of a remote understanding that it is by Muslims for Muslims, it is commissioned by someone else who's probably a Muslim, and that it is in the scene. That is the scene that comes to it. So again, this is a very troublesome manner of looking at what exactly is the root of Islamic arts or Islamic culture, is Islamic anything, because there is a line that is drawn, in fact a line that is drawn in the sand, that it is quite hard to erase, because to attempt to understand it, you sort of like have to cut through a lot of common understanding of what generally art is. So if you can see, this is a collection by the Metropolitan Museum of Arts, right, the Met. That a curation, it is not easy to curate works of Islamic culture, Islamic arts in that sense. But you can see there is a juxtaposition of a lot of things coming together, and it forces us, with our worldview, or as Muslims, to actually kind of be detached to the actual meaning of the object. So it is, the object is a word. So it is about the relation of objects, and objects being viewed and the viewer being viewed by an object, vice versa. So the optics of recollection is simply missing in this definition, right? And we will go with that. So the first examples of Islamic art therefore rely on earlier techniques, styles, form reflecting this blending of classical and Persian decorative themes and motifs. This definition is not by me. This definition is actually a snippet from the Met, but you can see that it is already boxing, or in a kind of putting in a chronological timeline here. You can see that Central Asia is of this period and so on, and then it goes down there, chronological in time. But if you realize how it is being set up, it is being set up quite completely easy to navigate, right? It's very easy to navigate. In fact, the word Persian here was in reference to Iran. So if you look at the politics and colonialism as a means of looking at recollection of heritage and memory, this is actually drawing up an imagery map in our minds of how things happen, or how cultures or societies, more so Muslim cultures, happen or created or began. And that is what I'm trying to see as, or deviate from. So even religious monuments erected under the Umayyad patronage that has a clearly Islamic function and meaning, such as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, demonstrate this amalgam of Greco-Byzantine and Senecine elements. And that is quite a easy thing to say, that there are elements here, there are elements there, we can see, we can draw a line across. So it is true. It is true in especially problematic because especially in Islamic architecture, because these are like we say or like we mentioned in the previous lectures, these are quite adaptive communities. These are quite adaptive periods that people are moving, societies are moving around, even patronages kind of like look into each other. But to say that there's a function and meaning, but it demonstrates just a syncretic kind of transference, it is simplistic. So only gradually with the influence of the Muslim faith caliphates did a uniquely Islamic art emerge. So that is another line drawn there. So the rule of the Umayyad Caliphate is often considered to be the formative period of Islamic art. The reason being is also historically, it is the most collection of material culture that we can at least document it. So one method of classifying Islamic art here is according to the dynasty reigning when the work of art was produced. So this action of optics, it is adapted by museums, adapted by historians, adapted by writers, and even us. So when we speak of tales of caliphates and empires of gone, we tend to get into this colonialist drive of those were the great times. Those were the arts that was in comparison to two different patronages, the Byzantine and Sasanian. They are not saying or undermining that kind of work of archiving and archaeology, but we tend to get into that kind of signifying momentum. So this type of periodization follows the general precepts of Islamic history, and it is divided into punctuated rules of various dynasties, right? So speaking of the dynasties, there are various parts and there are various times, and of course, if one were to dive in, it is in fact quite a deep pool. Of course, it is not to say otherwise. So Islamic art was inevitably subject to a wide range of regional and even national styles and influences, as well as changes within periods of its development. And even that caveat said, we tend to fall back into these boxes because it's just much easier to reach within. It is much easier to sort of like compartmentalize and get to do a comparative study, if you may say that. So even under these circumstances, Islamic art has always retained its intrinsic quality and unique identity. And this is very important here. Why is that so? Why is Islamic art, even though there's a huge change in dynasties across continents, across spans of centuries, there's a intrinsic quality and unique identity that we know that is Islamic. Mostly, it is something that may be sacred, that may be kind of revered, and that is a point to make here. But it is not mentioned in that kind of curation, right? Or not mentioned often. Just as the religion of Islam embodies a way of life and serves as a cohesive force among ethnically and culturally diverse people, the art produced by Muslim societies, has basic identifying and unifying characteristics. The identifiers and the unifying parts are the unique parts, and that is the one that makes it different or differentiated from the rest, right? So the differentiation here, it is this unique character. It's not differentiation in terms of um, it is Islamic because it's done by Muslims or patronages of Muslim empires and so on. So perhaps the most prominent and impressionable of this is the inkling of all over surface decoration, or in other words, ornaments, right? Ornamentation. Um, that is something that we have affinity to. I think in the previous discussions, at least the last 2 weeks, it has been brought up quite often. But I think this is where I want to sort of start and put the foundation for. So the four basic components of Islamic ornaments are calligraphy, vegetal patterns, the ever so popular geometric patterns, and figural representation, of course. But when we look at the narrative of ornamentation throughout the history of the built environment, it can be illustrated as such. If you look in terms of the time span of documented history, the most extreme left will be of ancient Egypt, right back up to 3050 BC up to 900 BC, where you can see ornamentation at play. It's just talking about ornamentation, or just to put it in a pixel timeline. Into the Roman Empire, stretches from 850 BC to 476 AD, leading on to the Byzantine and Islamic, right? So these are very particular and peculiar type of if you look into ornamentation is just not just over the surface motifs or decoration. It is really quite a means of communication. For example, ancient Egypt, as we know, murals and painted carvings, symbolic motifs is to actually record and tell a story. Like hieroglyphics is basically language itself, right? But it's also ornamentation at the same time. Leading into Alexandria, the Roman Empire, looking at geometric and plant-based ornaments. If you look at the column design, and when we look at these empires, these are not overnight empires. These are really spanning hundreds, almost hundreds of years, and across large bodies of land, right? And Byzantine leading into the Islamic geometric patterns that we know of today, right? Geometric, calligraphic, and floral decorations. But when you juxtapose the Islamic pixel here against everything else, one would realize that it's actually just a small snippet in the whole timeline of everything else. You go to the Romanesque, you go into the Gothic, Renaissance, and the Baroque, where of course the Renaissance and the Gothic is the most written, referenced, and even till today it is revered, right? So you can see that the role of Islamic influences is actually quite minimal, because it's just how the timeline or the curation of the timeline works. For example, the Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque usually are well spoken of and documented in that sense. But leading closer to this, and leading to more to our time, the Rococo, Neoclassicism, Art Nouveau itself, where ornamentation takes on a very different twist, right? It moves away from geometrical concentric forms. It's not so much about the structure anymore. It's actually about the influence. It's about the ornate, leading into a representation of the natural world, leading into a kind of a celebration and celebration of of the built environment, and ornamentation is being used particularly up to the Baroque as a sense of separation of the church, the state, the fifth estate, the nobility, the empire, and so on, right? And there is just a picture I wanted to paint, leading to our time, that how ornamentation could not and should not be looked at as just one aspect. Because if you look at Islamic architecture and arts in general, even ornamentation has 4 different forms. And if you look at the whole timeline of as presented here, it is a small pixel of everything else. So we are really delineating from this, right? So leading to closer to our time, where ornamentation is then being questioned, right? The modernists took it as an antithesis of what is ornamentation, but if it's not superfluous, or it means nothing else. So leading into our time in this millennia with parametric design, where there's a revival into looking at geometry, a lot of which I'm involved in, but there's a lot of back reading into geometry and iterations of what are the possible with computation, of course, that we can generate from. So with that said, I'll start by saying that the Quran is not a revealed set of syllogisms and prosaic rational proofs, but it is as a recitation of unparalleled linguistic beauty filled with symbols, stories, metaphors, and poetic phrasing. So we go back to the root. We go back to the exemplar. So Al-Jabir reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Verily, Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty." So the indifference to beauty is amounting to the indifference to the divine. So, and this is something that identifies Islamic arts, for example, that we can identify it as a quest for beauty. We can identify it as something that is related to beauty, and we can sort of appraise it as that. But it said here that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ said that verily Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty, and to go against that is to amount to be indifferent to this understanding. So in the Islamic tradition, the sense of beauty and excellence, at once aesthetic, ethical, intellectual, and spiritual, is encapsulated by the Quranic term ihsan. So the most known definition of ihsan comes from the hadith of Jibril, right, wherein the Prophet described to it as to worship God as you will see Him. If you do not see Him, He sees you. So this hadith is one of the important lessons for us, right? And it is actually a kind of showing the back to the point that the teacher and the relation of the teacher and what is being taught and the lesson and all that, and there's this transmission of this reverence, as we said earlier, to be indifferent or otherwise. So to worship God as if you see Him, otherwise He sees you. And that is something that we will uncover in terms of what does it mean to comprehend beauty, or to comprehend the optics of the Creator, or looking at us, being the seen, and in that sense the unseen. So the Islamic arts here cultivate ihsan because the visual and representational help us to worship God as if we see Him through these displays of beauty. For God is beautiful and He loves beauty. So it is an enabler. So the Islamic arts, and when we say arts, it is an encapsulating term that I use. It is enabler to see this as a conduit, because the visual and representational help us to worship God, right? In that sense, relating back to the hadith. This as if ka'ana seeing occurs through imagination, khayal, a term that has a technical definition in the Islamic tradition, in our tradition. So the seeing here, right, as if it goes back to the hadith. The seeing occurs through this imagination. So a bit of explanation of what this imagination is. It is not a kind of a direct translation into the English. Within the writings of Ibn Arabi and other Sufi thinkers, instead of representing something imaginary or unreal, imagination, khayal, here is a creative and perceptual faculty that embed pure meanings or ideas. So even the adaptation of khayal in the Malay origin or the Malay understanding of it, there's a negative connotation to this. There's a corruption of the understanding here. But I want to digress back to this meaning, that it means, or it alludes to pure meanings or ideas, right? The perceptual faculty that can ascertain that, and spiritual realities in sensory forms, and also perceives the meanings represented in these sensible forms. So it is actually the capability to understand, or capability to get this transmission to pure meanings or ideas. So it is a faculty responsible for true dreams and visionary experiences in interpretation. When the Prophet ﷺ saw milk in a dream and understood it to be the sensible form of the highest possible sensibilities of the reality of knowledge, or the truth here. So khayal here could be seen that dreams and visionary experiences, and as we know in the Islamic tradition, these are very true, and these are traditions of these are traditions that it means a lot to us. It's a loaded example here, right? And we know as well the relation of dreams and the significance of dreams, especially with the Prophet ﷺ, right? So it is to say that this is the state that is the most sensible form of the highest possible sensibilities to get to the reality of knowledge here. So imagination allows us to make the invisible world visible and to trace visible forms back to the invisible meaning. So it is a means of getting to that, right? To the meaning of things, the invisible. And this conduit, or this process, enables us to make a kind of way back to that, making the invisible into a visible form. So imagination is a barzakh, a liminal reality separating two realities, but also participating in them at the same time. So between the visible and the invisible worlds, alam ash-shahada wal al-ghaib, between the worlds of matter and spirit, and between sensory forms and intelligible meanings. So I will pause here a bit, because it is something that it takes a while to, or it takes a bit of rereading into this, where and how does this work? Because we have dealt with the imagination, which is the realm of the khayal, and in terms of the meaning, it has to be understood that it is a imagination which is a pure creative process and a perceptual faculty that embed pure meaning, so we can get to the sensibilities, the highest possible sensibilities of knowledge. And this imagination lies between a liminal reality, separating two realities, but in participation, uh, uh, existing in them, the creation and the destruction at the same time, and so on, right? So, in essence, it is a creative process. What you can, if you can imagine, you can create, and then what you create, you can also destroy. But in that sense, it is not, and it's not limiting to question, I think, um, the oneness of Allah and all of that. I think that is out of the discussion and the understanding here, where we say the creative or the creativeness of this is actually within our faculty of perception. Khayal has three meanings. First is everything that is not the absolute reality; it is outside of it, right? And absolute reality is, I think, it's safe to say that it is not by the means of our own access, right? So it is everything that is outside of it. Secondly, the human faculty that joins sensory forms to pure sensory forms to pure ideas. Sorry. And lastly, a specific level of reality experienced in truthful dreams and visions between the physical and the spiritual. Although these levels are considered, intertwined with the first, in the first sense. So it is just to lay it out here and get the definition correct in sort of framing what it is. Again, it is not the direct interpretation of what we know in even the colloquial Malay language, what khayal means here. So the third meaning of khayal has two aspects. Khayal mustasil, the subjective realm of personal dreams, and khayal munfasil, an objective level of reality that is more real than the physical but less real than the spiritual, that serves as a bridge between the two. And you will see that that the creative arts, or the process of creation and the creativeness in Islamic arts, has a bigger role, and this is one of it, is why it is distinctively different or differentiated from everything else out there, even with this definition. So it is a realm of true visions where spirits are embodied, and in the vision of an angel in human form, where bodies are spiritualized, as in the sensory experiences that occur after death. Right. So a bit of sidetrack and digression of the meaning here. So Ibn Arabi writes, know that you yourself are an imagination, and everything that you perceive and say to yourself, this is not me, is also an imagination, so that the whole world of existence is imagination within imagination. Right. So just as our dreams represent or manifest different aspects of our individual consciousness, the dream of everything other than God, Ma'asiwa Allah, reflects and represents different aspects of the indivisible divine unity. So the imagination here, and what Ibn Arabi says, it is alluding to not so much of a spiral. It is more of a grandeur, of a unimaginable imagination, that even it is beyond of what we can perceive and conceive of, right? So there's a higher level of consciousness, and it is indivisible, right? God's aspects, higher realms of aspects, in indivisible, but it shows in the indivisible divine unity. So there is a kind of reverence and grandeur. While it is possible to directly contemplate the divine because of its absolute unity, in order to contemplate something, there must be both a subject and object of contemplation, which would violate pure unity. The dream is composed of signs, ayat, and symbols that manifest and allow us to contemplate, meditate upon, and see aspects of the invisible divine. So this is also a unique way to look at Islamic arts or the creation of Islamic arts, is that um, it takes a different eye or a different way to see and comprehend. Um, and the word here, or the word here, literally is signs, right? Which is ayat, and symbols that manifest and allows us to contemplate, meditate upon. And it is within, and I think all of us can agree on this, is that it is within the tradition that the ayat, the signs are meant for just that. So when we look at calligraphy, when we look at Kufic scripts, it is more than recitation, right? Even there is one level of looking at it, but it is exactly to contemplate, meditate, and to see aspects of the invisible divine. And when we see, when we use the word "see" here, it is also a term that is interchangeably used to mean understanding, comprehension, and reverence to the divine unity, right? The Tawhid of things. So according to the poet Abu Attab, here in everything there's a sign that indicates that he is the one. The Quran states even more explicitly in Ayah Fusilah, we will show them our signs on the horizon and in themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. So the signs are there, and Allah put it to us, upon us, that there are signs for you to get to the truth, right? And like I think Dr. Faris said, the horizon of things. Yeah, right. It is quite impactful for that. So it is through imagination that the signs of creation come into existence. It is through imagination that we can trace them back to the origins and meanings, and that we can interpret and understand them by recognizing the aspects of the divine that they manifest. So getting to understand what it means, but before that, prior, we need to find the tools to interpret and understand, because then we can recognize these signs. One of them is actually, for example, it could be reading the Quran, right? First, you need to really learn the ayat and then put them together. And then with that comes an interpretation. And then with the interpretation, there are also other tafsirs that rereads into the meaning of this. So that is just one segment in terms of what this alludes to, but can be said as that. So Islamic arts play an important role in bringing the basic elements of our surroundings, such as light, shade, space, time, and color, scent, and silence, back into the geometric archetypal realities, the malakut, when the archetypal here is the angelic forms, right? The pure forms, the forms that the invisible forms, the forms that are of a different realm, which are more easily integrated into divine unity. And one reason Islamic civilization and its arts are so focused on geometry, right? So I may need to pause here for a while, but I think Faris, if you can jump in and yeah.
So then I was just taking notes here. We spoke about the varying orders and the discussion of the ayat as a way of mediating upon the truth, right? So the notion of the imaginal order, the natural order, and also I think perhaps you'll be speaking moving forward also about the created order. And I think uh, actually I was taking notes that one way for the created order which comes from men, in a way to better understand uh, the created order, or to see into the reality, right, of truth, and seeking for what would be the best instruments to understand this order. So Zan was speaking about reading of the Quran, for example, right? It has a particular order, particular rhythm, way to internalize it, to externalize it. I think as we come towards the notion of ornamentation, then we could seek out another type of language, and the language has to have its own instrument, for example. Um, Perhaps that instrument could be the compass. And I think that's where Zan is pausing here. And the notion of geometry comes into play. But that's me reading into what he is trying to get at. It's actually quite fascinating up to this point, because I think he's focused on the idea of vision and imagination, sight and also insight. So we are kind of attempting to blur the ideas here. This goes back also to one of the questions asked yesterday, whether the lectures are a series of ways to uh, judge beauty. But I think it's deeper than that. I think we are going beyond the notion of aesthetics, where we are in a realm of ornamentation becoming a tool of mediation. Um, Zan also, you mentioned about tafsir to explain the ayat, right? So I think now how does ornamentation becomes an exegesis, right? As a translation or a mediation to understand the realities of the world. Um, so I think that would be my contribution at this point, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Faris. So I will continue and pick up from there again. Yep. Okay. Yep. And all of this said so far, and I think Faris put it quite succinctly, is setting up the appreciation of what we've seen. And I highlighted geometry here is to also reiterate that it is just one aspect of Islamic representation in architecture, especially in the creative arts. So Islamic arts makes things metaphysically transparent. They allow us to perceive the light of God, and through them, as if they were stained glass windows. It is through the imagination, khayal, again, that the Islamic arts render the invisible divine visible, and it's through imagination that we can perceive the mysteries of transcendent divine unity immanent in these sensory forms. So imagination is often contrasted with reason, akal here in its limited meaning, where imagination is synthetic, while reason is analytic, where imagination is both and reason is either or, and ambiguous in character. Where imagination draws connections and analogies, reason separates and draws distinction. And this is something that I think we can appreciate in our tradition. Somewhat know the limits of our pursuit of questioning, even, and that's where reason and imagination, there is a distinction there. So akal is a term with different meanings and different contexts. Again, I'm trying to decipher and learn myself at the same time. Not a specialist in this, but distinguishing between the akal al-kulli or universal intellect, which is identified with the spirit al-ruh. As in the hadith, the first thing that God created was the intellect, the akal, and the first thing that God created was the spirit and the akal al-juzi, or partial intellect, which is our ordinary limited rational faculty, and which allows us to think logically and draw rational conclusions, almost like using the everyday logic. Imagination understands in modes foreign to reason, separated from, as an intermediary reality standing between spirit and body. It perceives abstract ideas and spiritual beings in embodied form. A bit here from Shittik. Since itself neither nor or the other, it is intrinsically ambiguous and multivalent. It can grasp the self-disclosure of God, which he, not he, or not he, reasons to demand to know the exact relationships in the context of either or. But in both here, but imagination perceives that self-disclosure can never be known with precision, since it manifests the unknown essence, and it is kind of like the beauty of it, right? We know that this kind of self-disclosure, or we will never attain in the pursuit completely the total manifestation of this unknown essence, but in the pursuit, in the creative process of uncovering, we believe that we are guided to that. So in this proposal, it is imagination, not reason, that is nuancedly equipped to encounter the ambiguities of manifest multiplicity and perceive the unity therein. It is imagination that can trace seemingly contradictory statements and phenomena back to the common origins that unites them, without erasing their distinctiveness from the level of sensory forms. The imaginal faculty that can both represent and perceive the same truth or reality in a tree, in a geometric pattern, in the world of calligraphy, in the verses of poetry, despite the differences that we can see. Ibn Arabi and Imam al-Ghazali and many of the other notable scholars have argued that reason and imagination must work together to completely comprehend and interpret the science of God. So both his books and the books of the cosmos and the human soul. So again, it alludes back to the book, it alludes back to the workings of the self, to really comprehend the cosmos and to know oneself, and to even understand what we see before us, for he sees us. And this is clearly illustrated in one of the most profoundly paradoxical verses of the Quran. There is nothing like unto him, yet he is hearing the same. So just to cover a bit more ground, since we already covered reason and imagination, so in bold here, seeing with two eyes, with both reason and imagination, that we can see, we can come to know God through his signs. Again, this is not quite literal to see things with two eyes, but it is to see with the eyes of reason and imagination, the mind and the heart, that we can comprehend the signs, as we mentioned previously. So the twofold here of the Islamic arts is that they make the divine truth and the truth of its revelation present and tangible to us, while imbuing our tangible surroundings with the beauty of divine truth. When we talk about beauty, we have to put it in the understanding that the Jalal, or the divine majesty and rigor, corresponds to the pull of truth, while Jamal, divine beauty, corresponds to that of the presence. Neither can exist without the other. That is the force that moves everything in the cosmos, including our souls, both back and forth towards the divine origin and to the infinite end. And in the Quran, quite explicitly stated a number of times that God loves the beautiful doers, muhsinin, numerous times, right? The muhsinin here, could it be the artisans or the creative artists who does these beautiful doings? Right? So Imam al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina extended this definition of love as an inclination or attachment to do what is pleasing, perfect, or beautiful. And there is a gentle presence of beauty and love causes the sakina, the deepest peace, and they engendered by the awareness of the presence of God. Right? So both the harmony of the geometry makes the barakah, sacred presence of the space tangible and bringing our souls together. So that is just bringing to discussion spatial implications. So beauty inspires love and love moves our soul, but differentiating itself from the adornments of this world. So Zinat al-Haya al-Dunya, which really are a simulation or shadow of true beauty. So as we know that this dunya or this world is nothing but a passing phase. So in more a definition here that I use is a simulation, right? Which is far from the truth of true beauty. So how does one differentiate beauty of Islamic arts and distracting the hypnotizing beauty of the dunya? So in order to distinguish Islamic art from the other forms, we must first define and demarcate Islamic arts in the terms negotiated above. So this is where I will maybe perhaps looking at time would like to end. It is a kind of, if you were to follow me through, it is a kind of redrawing this demarcation of line, where at first I stated where is Islamic arts placed in terms of the timeline or in terms of our understanding. But I think here it could be for the next starting point where we must redefine and demarcate and reappropriate this definition in the terms negotiated above, where now we know where it stands, but how do we proceed from there? Yeah. So it is. I started with setting up where we are at, but I think it'll be beneficial for us to conclude that with this, definition and demarcation. With that, yeah.
Bismillah. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Zan, for the dars and the sharing, and also Dr. Faris for coming in and just kicking off the discussion. This is not really just a Q&A. It's more of like a discussion, or more like just a conversation. Yeah, for those who have just tuned in, this is the History and Theory of Architecture Islam, the Body, Image and Spirit of Place by both Dr. Faris Hajamaddin and Faizan Shah. So it's a series of lectures, and tonight is the third installment. So next week is the last one. So whatever that we went through with Zan, inshallah, we're going to continue next week. But yeah, we're going to kick off this short sharing and discussion with both Dr. Faris and Zan. Based on what Zan actually spoke about, I just pick something, I guess, a bit more like, I don't know, more open-ended, yeah? So you did mention about how imagination draws connections and how reason separates and draws distinctions, right? I think with regards to this, Zan, or even Dr. Faris, if you'd like to definitely share your insight, to what extent did the Muslim thinkers, or those who design such great mosques and monuments in the Islamic world, to what extent was it more of a imagination, and to what extent did they use reason to actually, draw the distinction in their architectural designs? Or was it something that they got inspiration from nature? Or where did their inspiration come from? Yeah.
Then maybe
Yeah.
you trace the outline first. I come in after you then.
Yeah, I think the imagination here is more towards a kind of duality, which is what I'm trying to sort of like highlight in this long and winding talk is that imagination here is not so much of a one-way process. It is actually unique to the Islamic tradition where it comes on understanding of the oneness of God, the deep understanding comprehension of the sciences, deep understanding and comprehension of uncovering the science itself. And I don't think it is a literal imagination of, you know, rationale and then irrational methodology. I think it is something that just highlighting that is unique to our tradition, that this is happens and it can delineate and be demarcated as opposed to everything else that is out there.
I think we have been brought up on a diet on how to think about the term reason or rationale, right? So we also can't project from where we are backward to the pre-modern age, for example, because the notion of reason or akal, right? It's there are layers in our consciousness that allows us to experience reality in different dimensions and different depth. So that's why there's always a contestation between the philosophers and the Sufis, right? On who has got the actual tools to really unpack the realities of the divine, right? And many a times, because again, we try to back project, and they are scholars at that level, and they're quite interchangeable. We get intertwined in their debates. But it's all really depends on the argument, and there is really no discrimination or thinking about what faith is, what divinity is, and where man ends and where God takes over. So I just want to set that out because what we think of as reason, especially in the scientific world, is the reason is an instrument for us to verify the truth or confirm the truth. But in another world order, and I still owe you an answer about the sacred and the profane, which I still don't have today, right? In the sacred order, it's not that easy because man ultimately does not have the tool or the verbiage or the way to articulate what truth is. And there could be many possibilities or several possibilities to arrive at that end game, right? So where I'm coming to at the end, and Zan spoke about it, there is a truth via dreams, and that's part of our tradition, right? And there's also a truth where you're told to look at the ayat and contemplate, right?
Yes.
So I cannot give an easy answer here because you asked an even more difficult question with how this played out with the craftsman, right? My take, and this is a limited knowledge I have here, it is just that if one is unable to separate these two, and they're part of a tradition, is the lived reality, right? The imagination and reason is just of different orders, right? Between, say, in that tradition, no one would say a poem is false. You cannot say that, right? Would you say Rumi's poetic metaphors are false? No, they are another key to understanding the world. So using decorations, ornaments, for example, right?
Yes.
as an instrument to see the reality is reason for us. It's a tool. It's almost quote unquote a scientific tool to understand a reality, right? So I think we should leave that as a way, if anyone is listening, right, to keep this simmering, because we have easy definition to split these elements apart. Yeah.
Yes. It's a very interesting sharing, Dr. Faris. You mentioned that we've been so caught up in certain very strict limitations of how we define reason, and I guess it's not as clear cut as black and white, as I suppose in
No,
that sense.
it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to draw upon another thing that Zan mentioned. Of course, Dr. Faris, do jump in for this. You did mention, Zan, you did mention about the ayah of the Quran. We shall show them our signs in the horizon and in themselves until it is clear to them that He is the truth, that this is the truth. How did the thinkers, the Islamic, scholars, or those who thought about architecture, how did they utilize this ayah in their works, and what are some of examples that of them using inspiration in the horizon? Perhaps does that mean nature? What are some examples of them using or applying such an ayah in their works, and how they thought about architecture and how they built the architecture?
Yeah. So I think actually, Abu, I have actually, I think, two more slides that I thought that was a punchline, but it hasn't. But I think with this, let me share.
Okay, the
Let me
punchline
share
period.
this. Yeah, because that will set the basis of
Okay, sure.
I think why certain
Yeah.
scholars and hold on, let me get to, and this is unique to our tradition.
Interesting.
Let me see. We were here, right?
Yes.
And I think the form and the content of traditional Islamic art springs directly from Quranic revelation and diffuses the essence of Muhammadan blessing. And that is an important point because not only about the signs of the horizon, it actually comes to understanding that it comes from prophetic revelation. So Syed Hussein Nasir here, when he attempted to distinguish between Islamic sacred art and traditional Islamic art, he says that the sacred art relates directly to the central practices of the religion and the practices of the spiritual life, all of which are being traditional, also reflected the principles of Islamic revelation and Islamic spirituality, but more indirect manner. But the sense sacred art is the heart of the traditional art. So it is something that not only defines this tradition, it also defines everything that comes out of this tradition. So the true source of Islamic art is the Islamic revelation, not of its historical presences and influences. So it is not everything else. And the singular origin accounts for this remarkable unity across time and space. So that's why it is very hard, or actually it's very convenient for curatorial bodies, colonizers and so on, to put this in a box. Because it is no different when you talk about now, and then you talk about the time where of the Prophet, because it comes from there. And this sanad, right? It is out of that transmission. And out of this revelation, that's why we can unpack. And that's why there are certain known forms. And that's why there are certain known methodologies. Yeah, so I think this is where I should end.
Thanks, Zan. Dr. Faris, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I'm thinking about it in two ways, right? I think I think one way we are struggling to grasp it is because, again, we have certain ways of thinking about Islamic and architecture or art, etc. And I think in this series of lecture, we are trying to almost suspend that or resist that, and almost set or do an archaeological dig to find out where is the heartbeat or the spiritual center that emanates, right? So I was thinking about this after last week's lecture, and There's a wonderful hadith where the Sahaba would say they would look at the moon, which for them was the most beautiful thing. You must know the beauty. We can't appreciate the beauty of the moon. And then they will look at the face of the Prophet, and the face of the Prophet is much beautiful than the moon. I mean, as a comparison, you cannot touch it, right? And for a while, you know, so when the Prophet was around, what was there need for even ornamentation, right? Because he's the one who ornaments wherever he is. His presence ornaments in complete details. You know, it just pervades everything, right? And then if you think through that, I was thinking about it, right? Then because it's a lived reality, and after his passing, over a period of time, certain things become codified, right? Certain knowledge systems become codified, and then people would say controversies comes about, but I would think natural tension needs to be in any civilization. So the schools of thought, the Sufi paths, for example, did not exist during the Prophet's time, because then we start to have a distance. And then because there's a distance, we have to find new types of sciences or new types of activities for us to close the gap. So calligraphy comes about, right? So we are trying to reach back into the origin through different means. And then scholars help us build these bridges, because we have lost that space or the closeness to the Prophet, right? So there's a pathway through fiqh, for example, hadith collection, building mosques in a particular way. So Zan, you can come in and say, I think there's a real absent here, because in a way, what we are trying to get here, even the type of geometries, crafts, etc., is another kind of activity to reach back to the origin. And I think, at least in your lecture, becomes clearer. You're trying to find that origin, where anything emanated. Except there is no codification of it. There's no text written about it. We are trying to do an exegesis through the built forms or the written works, etc., on how what has arrived here tends to connect back to the origin. Right. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm thinking about, because although there is no text written, there's a real consistency. And I think Zan mentioned it as well, right? That there is a way people have continued to interpret what would be the Islamic, or what we call the architectural Islam, right? Yeah. And then it is emanating from somewhere. So I just go back to what Zan mentioned. He spoke about, Zan, I think in the Ikhwan diagram, the vegetal, animal, etc. I think it keeps coming back. Or even in your opening, where there's certain forms that keeps repeating in the Islamic tradition again and again. So at least that's how I'm interpreting this. I think perhaps we have lost touch of architecture or any build form. And I'm not limiting this to the Islamic tradition as a way of mediating the truth, as a mediation of the truth with a capital T, or reality. Yeah. Because you're mediating with the screen all the time. Yeah, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah,
We are
but
in a simulation.
we are in a simulation. Interesting indeed. Dr. Faris, based on that same thread about you said that the trend is moving away from this mediation. So does that mean that such modern works are moving away from such pointing towards the divine?
I think it's not the modern work per se. I think it's just our own conditioning, right? I think we have also lost the toolkit or the atmosphere to feel a particular way about any building, because it is just a building, right? And the ways we go on about describing the building, I mean, what's there to say about an IKEA table? Table, you know what I mean? It's our whole worldview has changed to a point, right? Anything that is spoken about right now, it almost feels strange, even for someone like me, continues to feel strange, even though I've been doing researches in this, right? Because it is not my lived reality anymore. Like even if I go to mosques, and they're really wonderful mosques in Singapore, right? I don't know. I'm not so sure we are taken aback, and then we can feel a way towards the geometry or the floral patterns and make connections and think about ayat, etc. Right? I'm not so sure that kind of consciousness kicks into us intuitively. So it perhaps has got nothing to do with the architecture itself, because whatever is put in front of us, I think some level of distanciation has happened to us. So even the things me and Zan are saying, so Zan, please correct me if I'm wrong. It's still in a distance. We are almost theorizing it, because it is not a natural way of understanding these things anymore, right? So what I was trying to say with my previous answer is we almost like need a tarika right now for someone to lead us, and I'm quite serious about it, because there is no language with us to come together with the build form. And how does this even connect to our spiritual activities? It's not quite sure yet, right? Uh, and that's why when we do the Hajj, it's open air, right? And you're circling, you're doing something with the structure which is quite different. And the way, in fact, we are creating ornaments, the way we are participating with build forms.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just going to stop there, because
That's interesting.
I'm going in several tangents
That's
here. So
interesting.
Zan, please
It's okay.
save me here. Yeah.
Zan, do you have anything to add to what Dr. Faris mentioned?
No, I think it's also in one of the slides. It says that so if you are indifferent to the beauty, is amounting to being indifferent to the divine. There is I think just how we are so disassociated, and by even understanding that it is really getting to that, I guess, the indifference and indifferentiation of the self.
Actually, Zan, if I could jump in, Brother Abbas, so sorry. And last week you brought up about Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad's Cambridge Mosque, right?
Yes.
And we also spoke about Prof. Naqib Al-Attas, hand in Istak, right? I think they have not moved away from the reality I'm talking about. I think at least I have moved away. Right? For them, that's why from the influence, the reason and the imagination of Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, that mosque can come about.
Mashallah.
And even looking at it, right, it drives something, at least for me, right? It's something about the way it is built. There's a kind of uncanniness about it. The timber is kind of creeping up. It just doesn't feel like an ordinary architecture. There's an additional step to do something quite extraordinary with the space, right? He's trying to
It is
pull a
not being
tradition.
indifferent.
Yeah, and it feels in a modern world, it's a kind of a displacement. You don't. It feels like it is out of place or out of time a little bit. There's a bit of disjuncture there, right? And I think, and I would like to think he is the architect. I just would say it anyway, right? And you can feel it. You can feel it. That when someone who has that acumen or that spiritual insight, and when they guide the building process, that's why I say that we almost need a spiritual guide to build these things, and then bring someone into that space. And I think that has been realized in some way. And I'm sure there are many other buildings. And Singapore also, you can feel it in some spaces. But I thought that is, in time to come, I think that building would be studied. I do not know much about it. So Zan, is another thing. We'll put it out there. Next week is the last lecture, and probably we won't cover it. Still haven't got
But this is a very interesting thread to follow, Dr. Faris and Zan, because when you mentioned about Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad and how he envisions the mosque, and even Prof. Naqib Al-Attas and how he kind of envisioned Istak, what comes to mind for me is which comes first, the architect or the building itself? And how does the relationship actually affect each other? For example, if a master architect, like for example, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad built that mosque, and let's say I would go to the mosque and I do not have the awareness, the appreciation for divinity or even art, will I be able to, see what he saw, in the beauty? Or so in a sense, it's the people, and there's a connection between who actually goes to the mosque and what's my state when I go to the mosque and how I appreciate it, And I think this is something I wanted to touch on the idea of the community actually affecting who is the community that actually is inside the architecture, or is it the architecture that actually has an impact on the community itself?
Zan, you want to tackle that first?
Um,
Oh,
I think that is interesting, but I don't really have a kind of a, or I would kind of like prevent myself from giving a blanket, um, because it is actually a manner of understanding of how to view things eventually. And I think if you look at communities, if you look at really study communities like communities in Tarim, for example, the places that we have been, like Medina Bay, for example, there is a certain consensus of how uh, what is being appreciated, what is outside of this common understanding, and I think that is in within the realm. You see, you have to be in the bubble, right, to bubble of understanding to get into this. But I think there is no. It's hard to say this. I mean, I wouldn't want to agree that there's this separation, because it's almost how um, just a secular society used to work, right? The church and the state and its separation, and the devices within. But I would like to at least put it here and believe that in our tradition, that there is a common senses um, of a bubble that sort of like permeates this common understanding.
Okay.
I think my response would be, I think the answer we're looking for is, yeah, a group of people will go in and they'll be moved by the building, right? Whether that could be done, right? So I think before we speak about this movement or the movement caused by the building and whether it is positive or negative and whether there could be an agreement, I think that's what the question you were alluding to, Brother Abu, whether there'll be an agreement, right? Because some people may discredit it, right? Some may, but I do believe certain structures or artifacts has the ability to evoke everyone, right? I think we can share that common space even beyond religious boundaries. I think it's possible. There's certain things that binds us and at least pushes us to an understanding to question our own realities. I think it's possible as a human being, right? So when we go to cemeteries, for example, even if it is not of our own faith, because death matters to us in different ways, there is a kind of hushness that creeps upon all people, the way we envisage death, etc. Right? So at some very powerful and deep levels, when any sort of activity, uh, um, speech, poetry, buildings impacts or calls something to the human being himself, right? Of his realities, the lower or the higher. Uh, I won't say everyone will stand back and say, "Oh, this is beautiful," right? Because that word has a whole other depth of meaning. But I think it would provoke, it will allow for a conversation to begin. I think that element of it, I believe so. Yeah. It's a very difficult discussion, and it will take a long time to unpack this. But perhaps if those listening can think of spaces where as humanity we share some level of commonality or shared experiences, with memorials, for example, and I spoke about cemeteries, a simple example that comes to mind. And even when you step into someone else's place of worship, why do you behave in a particular way, right? Something happens to us, especially if there is a grandiosity to the space, right? There's a way we behave towards it. It changes us, right? Yeah. And if someone is not moved, then it goes back to someone's conditioning as well, right? Because they cannot tell the A from the B because we have become so desensitized, right? And we only know how to change the channel, I think, and everything is like everything else. So yeah.
But
So
we're
yeah.
talking about, yeah, maybe
Interesting.
that is on a level of religious orders, but also I think to not to forget on the other side, the stratification of or the distribution of power is also being used in architecture quite often. You know, you go to the state courts, you go to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
That is one example of it is to showcase that a reverence of power control. And I'm putting on my post-structuralist hat here, but yeah, Faris.
Yes.
Very interesting point. A thread to follow. The idea of all architecture created equal in that sense, lah. I mean, what are the different structures that cause certain types of
Of course not.
popular than others? So yeah, I guess that's something interesting. I guess we probably need to wrap up. To be honest, I think we can dive in a lot more into the specifics, like maybe even in the Nusantara region, even like what are some of the interesting things that you guys, I mean, both of you can share. I mean, maybe we can touch a little bit on this before we end. Bismillah.
I think I'm gonna touch this, particularly not so much of the Nusantara, but I think we're gonna talk, or at least I'm gonna cover a bit more of who we already mentioned, which is one of the Nusantara great thinkers, which is Professor Nakib Al-Atas, and bringing in adab in the all the scheme of things, the adab of all beings, and how does this fall into place. And I think that is a good way to wrap up. And I think it's just homage to the kind of the knowledge that we've been reading into.
MashaAllah. Nice. How about you, Dr. Faris?
So number one, I must qualify, I don't have much deep knowledge of the Nusantara region and the architectures, but one thing that has always captured my attention, at least in more of the rural setting, is the mosque is perhaps not the most grandiose project as we know it, right? So it got me thinking as well, and so I'm also coming into twine here because again and again is we have certain ways of interpreting what beauty is, right? And a couple of hours ago when Zan and I had a conversation, we were talking about orality, right? The sounds that also comes together within the space, the activities that are continual within the space. So I think there's a particular type of activity that happens in mosques in this region. That's number one. Number two, the simple kampong mosques, etc., which looks simplistic from an eye from the big project that Zan was showing just now, right?
Yes.
But I think, so again, it's about the vision, right? For a particular community and its sensibility, that evokes a type of ayat through which to meditate about a different reality. And I'll just leave it at that because I think in what we call simple, it's not really simple, right? It's because the way that mosque is built by the community in itself is reaching towards a mediation or understanding of a reality. And I perhaps want to complicate the conversation there and leave it for Zan to wrap it up next week. Sorry, I don't think I gave you an answer you decide, but I think any type of approach towards all these things is a level of complexity, and it's good to think through on a Wednesday night.
It's a very interesting way to end it, Dr. Faris. Zan, do you want to add anything else before we end?
No, I think we're good. I think thanks for hosting us once again.
Yeah, thank you.
And
having the patience with us too. Yeah.
No, it's always interesting to so to speak, like go down the rabbit hole with both of you.
It's
and,
a rabbit hole. That's right. Yeah.
It is. And see where we end up with the string. I mean, both of you did mention this is an evolving conversation, and it is building up of the vocabulary of how to look at life, or rather how to look at architecture. Yeah.
Yes. I think it would be a mistake to limit it to think of these lectures as looking at architecture, though. I think that's the last thing we want to do, because in any pre-modern culture, art did not live separate in a way to go to a museum to appreciate it. It was yet another medium to philosophize or intellect or think about realities of lives. Yeah. And maybe that's where then we should end.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, I started the lecture with an image of Peter Sanders, the man praying.
Mm.
And I think that is also to pick up from the simplicity
Mm.
and also the reality of what we are driving towards, which is the truth and the origin of that.
Inshallah.
Yeah.
And yeah, besides paying homage to the tradition, I think this conversation is it is a great reflection, a contemplation of going back to the divine, going back to the source of everything. And I think that's amazing. And yeah, we have a lot more that we can possibly go to, but we are running out of time. Inshallah, we'll continue the conversation next week, same time, Wednesday. But thank you so much, Dr. Faris and also Zan. Inshallah, we'll see you both next week.
Thank you. Thank
May
you.
Allah bless both of you.
Thank you all, and apologies if we have taken the conversation sidetrack or in ways
No,
which.
no, it's always a pleasure to exploit with both of you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum
Assalamualaikum.
warahmatullahi
Waalaikumsalam.
wabarakatuh. Take care, both of you. All right. Bismillah. All right, Alhamdulillah. We've come to the end of the Facebook live session, The History and Theory of Architectural Islam, the Body, Image and Spirit of Place by Dr. Faris, Hajar Maidin and Faizan Shah. I don't know about you guys, but that was a very insightful discussion as always. We will continue it next week, same time, Singapore time, 8:30 p.m. Next Wednesday, inshallah. If you are keen, do check out our social media for our other programs. But one short announcement before we end, the link for the Korban in Senegal is on the comments. Our volunteers probably put it up. So it's bit.ly/Africa Korban. Yes, those of you who would like to fulfill your Korban rights in Senegal, you can just click on the link and inshallah, you can proceed with the transaction. And we hope that you continue to pray for us, our volunteers who work tirelessly behind the screen to give you guys this online experience. And of course, our directors, Sidi Khalid Ajmain and Saida Ainun Harun, may Allah bless both of them. Please forgive us for our shortcomings, and we'll see you next week, inshallah. Same time, 8:30 p.m. Wednesday. And with that, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh.